Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today I thought I'd do a kind of introductory video to one of my main reading challenges that I set myself for 2024 and going onwards. I will explain why going onwards. But basically, if you watched my goals video, reading goals for 2024 video, you will know that I started a reading around the world challenge. I have been meaning to start this challenge for years and years, but I have to be honest, it's kind of intimidating because this is definitely a challenge where it's like, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so, yeah. Let's get into it. How am I gonna approach this challenge? And also, since I have already read books in this challenge without officially starting this challenge, which books do I already have? So, reading around the world, the way I decided to do this, I went onto Google and looked up a list of all official countries of the world, so UN accepted countries, and then also a bunch of contested territories, since this is intended to be very much a challenge that encourages me to read from a lot of different perspectives and from a lot of different places. And then I put all of those countries in a spreadsheet, and then I looked for which countries and contested territories I already had books. And I actually already had, I think, 27 books or something, or 29 books read. Right now, since we're already 2 months into 2024 and I'm currently reading a book a month for this challenge, this is why I'm saying it's a marathon, not a sprint, because with over 300 books to read, I think over 300 books to read, you know, with 12 books a year, I won't get very far per year. This will be a challenge for the next decade, probably. And looking here, I have not over 300, but I have like 230 or something books that I'm gonna have to read in total. Where was I? Yeah, the way I'll go about it is I'll read a book a month for now, and then also if I happen to read any other books additionally that interest me, obviously I will also log those for the challenge. And the way I went about it is that it's kind of hard a lot of times to figure out if I should count a book for this challenge or not, because a lot of times you might have authors born in a country but then they moved, or you know, they have still strong connections to a certain country or whatever. So the way I'm going about it is that for now I am counting authors that have been born in a country and at least have spent a sizable portion of their childhood and youth in that country, but they don't necessarily have to live in that country anymore. So sorry, I got distracted for a second and I had to look something up. But yeah, so I will also count authors if they have been born in a country but moved somewhere else during their teenage years or even later. However, once I have everything filled on my list, I will probably then go back and try to discover other authors for those countries, authors that have stayed in those countries. But obviously, depending on what country and what territory we're talking about, shit might get difficult for me. I won't necessarily always have access to books from every single country. I won't necessarily find books for every single country. So basically, we're gonna try and find out how things are going as we're moving along. And also then if you have countries, or if I have countries like, for example, South Africa, where you have white populations and also non-white populations, or a lot of African countries, New Zealand, Australia, etc. I might have white authors for now for a lot of those, not a lot of those countries, for a couple of those countries, but I will in the future try to also read from black authors from those countries, for example. And then also when it comes to indigenous communities, I probably, just realistically, will not get around to reading books from indigenous communities, from every single indigenous community in the world. That's just not realistic. However, if I find books from prominent indigenous communities in certain countries, for example Maori in New Zealand, Sami in Sweden or Finland. I will also try, like, I have specific rows for those communities on my spreadsheet. I hope all of that makes sense, but now let's get into the books that I have already and for which countries I have them. I will try to just give you a very quick synopsis for each of those books and what my general thoughts were on them. Maybe also tell you when I first read them and if they're translated or if they were originally written in English. And let's start with the first country on the list. I'm going by alphabetical order, where I have already read a book from that country, and that is Kalpa Imperial, The Greatest Empire That Never Was, by Angelica Gorodisha, which was translated by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is, I think I said it, it's an Argentinian author. It's a fantastical short story collection. I think I gave it like 3 stars when I first read it, which was 2021. This was published in 1983, and the original language is Spanish. It was translated into English, and I think, yeah, I gave it 3 stars because I felt like I was lacking a lot of historical context personally, which obviously is my own fault, not the book's fault. So yeah, first book. Next book, Australia obviously is one of those countries where I will make sure to read books by First Nations Australian people as well. But the book that I have on this list for now, because it's my favorite book by an Australian author, is The Magician's Guild by Trudy Canavan, which is the first book in the Black Magicians trilogy, which obviously was one of the series that got me into reading high fantasy. And this is following a teenage girl who discovers that she has magic, even though she's from the slums and supposedly only the nobles have magic. And so the people from the Magician's Guild in this series go on this crazy chase after her to make sure that she comes to the guild and she learns how to use her magic. I do not remember when I first read this anymore, but this was first published in 2001. I first read it in German, which was translated by Michaela Link. Obviously, I have read plenty of Austrian authors, so if I have read multiple authors from the same country, I just usually chose my favorite of those books. And for Austria, that was Wunschloses Unglück by Peter Handke. I always forget what this book is translated in English. Obviously, if you want to read Peter Handke, go read into his controversies first, see if he is actually an author that you want to pick up. But yeah, this was originally published in 1972, and this is a kind of memoir that he wrote for his mother, dealing with his mother's suicide. So I think in the year before that or 2 years before that, his mother committed suicide, and so he wrote this book. And when I read it, just a lot of the stuff in here reminded me of my own grandmother. It deals a lot with how his mother lived in rural Austria after the Second World War. And so yeah, there's a lot, there was a lot in this book that I just could really connect to. So yeah, this one was for Austria. Then next we have Barbados, which is Redemption in Indigo by Karen Lord. This was originally written in English. By the way, this was originally written in German and I read it in German, obviously. This was written in 2010. I also first read it in 2021. 2021 was the year when I tried to read a lot of international fantasy. I did make a whole video talking about my experience doing that, so I will leave that link down below. So yeah, my reading international fantasy, I guess, was the first step to starting this challenge properly, and it's part of the reason why I do already have a bunch of books on this challenge. Yeah, this one is kind of modern folklore-esque. It's very folklore inspired. There's a lot of folklore figures or Caribbean, Western African folklore figures type figures, trickster figures appearing in this story, and I really enjoyed it when I read it. Then the next country I have is Belgium. I do not have the book here because I borrowed it from my dad, and the book was Maigret et le Fantôme by Georges Simenon, which is, I didn't write down when it was published, but this is a mystery novel. Maigret is kind of this series by the author Georges Simenon, that's kind of, you know, this detective that I think is doing his detectiving mostly in Paris, if I remember correctly. So yeah, I also read this in 2021, and I read it in French back when I read it, which is the language in which it was written in. Then continuing on, we have the most recent book that I added to the list, which obviously is at the very bottom of the stack, and it's for Botswana. It's Womb City by Tlotlo Tsamase. And this one I actually did an audio. I really enjoyed it. I will upload a full review on it. It's a new release. It only came out, I think, at the end of January. So 2024 release, 2024 book. It's Afrofuturism. I really enjoyed it. I can highly recommend the audiobook, probably more so than the physical copy, because I did, once I got the physical copy, I did try to read a little bit into it. I enjoyed the audiobook way more. And this was also written in English, and I read it in English. Then for Canada, I think I have the book down here. Let me try to get it off of this stack. I don't know how to do this without throwing everything on the ground. Yeah. So for Canada, I have Jade City by Fonda Lee, because Fonda Lee is a Canadian author. This was first published in 2017. I first read it in 2021. And obviously it was written in English, and I don't think I have to tell anyone what Jade City is about. Highly enjoyed it, can highly recommend, read it in English. Next I have Chile, and that is Die Stadt der wilden Götter. I do not remember what this is called in English, but it's the first book in a trilogy, which is, I think, called something along the lines of Eagle and Jaguar or something. It's by Isabel Allende, was written in 2002, and it's a middle grade, not fantasy, but it's a middle grade series. It's like, there is some criticism of it, because especially it's really weird because it was written by Isabel Allende, right? But the main character is an American teenager. I don't know. I will probably try and find another book for Chile, but for now this is the one that I have on this list. It was originally written in Spanish. I read it in German, and the translation was by Svenja Becker. Continuing on, we have China with A Hero Born by Jin Yong. This is the first book in the Legends of the Condor Heroes, which is a wuxia series. Yeah, it's a wuxia series. You would probably, like, if you try to fit this into Western genre conventions, this would probably be historical fantasy. I'm not sure I actually want to do that. This was first published in 1957. I also read it in 2021. It was translated from, it just says, I think it was translated from Chinese, which, you know, I don't know if that means it was translated from Mandarin or not, because obviously Chinese is not necessarily Chinese. It just says first published in the Chinese language. So yeah, that's all I can tell you. And it was translated into English by Anna Homewood. This is actually a quite recent new translation, which came out like a couple of years ago. Next one I have is Colombia with 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This was first published in 1967. It is a magical realism family saga. I first read it in 2021 also. And this was originally written in Spanish and translated into English by Gregory Rabassa, at least the translation that I read. So then we have quite a few countries where I haven't read anything at all yet, and we just fully skipped D and E, and we're next at F and France. And for France, while I did read multiple French books already, I chose The Count of Monte Cristo, or Le Comte de Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, which was first published in 1844. I guess, like, this is one of those books where it's kind of iffy to have a publishing date, because if I remember correctly, this was like serialized in its publication and you got like chapters at once that were published in a journal and stuff, and then it was just collected and put into one book. And I first read this in 2020. It was translated from French, obviously, into English. I read it in English, and this version was published by Peter Washington. Not published, translated. Germany is another one of those countries where I could have picked plenty of different books, and the book that I went with was Inkheart by Cornelia Funke, or Tintenherz, which was first published in 2003. I genuinely, once again, do not know when I first read this, so I just have a question mark. This was one of the books that I read in my teenage years before I had Goodreads or anything along those lines, and I obviously read it in German, which is the country, not the country, the language in which it was published in. Then moving on, we're at India, and for India I have for now Upon a Burning Throne by Ashok K. Banker, which is the first book in the Burnt Empire saga, and this was published in 2019. I read it in 2021, and this was published in English, and I also read it in English. This is high fantasy and way too complicated to try to sum up in like 2 or 3 sentences. Next we have Ireland, and for this one I have Children of Gods and Fighting Men by Shauna Lawless, who is a Northern Irish author. I couldn't find right now, like off the bat, like an author from the Republic of Ireland. So I might try to also find an author for the Republic of Ireland, just so I have, you know, both parts of Ireland covered, because, you know, with all the tensions, I feel like that might be a good thing. But anyway, so this was first published in 2022. I first read it in 2023, and it was written in English, and this is historical fantasy set at the time when the Viking reign in Ireland is kind of slowly passing and Christianity is taking over. For Italy, we have another one of my teenage years favorites, and that is the Chronicles of the Emerged World, the first book, Nihal from the Land of the Wind by Licia Troisi. This one I read in German. It was first published in 2004, and for some reason I apparently specifically know that I first read it in 2007. I do not know where I know that from, but if it says so on my spreadsheet, it must be true. It was originally written in Italian. I read it in German, and the translation is by Bruno Gensler. And this one is YA high fantasy, following a girl who just really wants to become a dragon rider. However, girls aren't allowed to become dragon riders, and in the background there's this big war going on. Next I have Jamaica, and here I have Black Leopard Red Wolf by Marlon James, who is a queer Jamaican author who lives in exile because of his queerness. So he lives in the US. He's originally from Jamaica. This book was first written in 2019. I read it in 2022. It was first written, or originally written, in English, which is the language in which I read it in. And this is high fantasy inspired by, I think, mostly Western African mythology. Japan was one of those countries where I actually had plenty of books to choose from, but the book that I chose was The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa, which is a kind of dystopian style novel where regularly things just are forgotten, and because they're forgotten, they just vanish on this island. I absolutely loved this, absolutely adored it. It was first published in 1994. I read it in 2020. The original language in which this was published was Japanese. I read it in English, and it was translated by Stephen Snyder. Then we have Kenya. For this one I have Wizard of the Crow by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. This is written by an author who was also living in exile. Actually, I think living in exile since the 70s or something, or the 80s, because of his criticism of the Kenyan government at the time. And that is also a little bit what this book is about. It's also, I would say, magical realism in terms of genre. It was first published in 2006. I read it in 2021. It was originally written in Kikuyu, which is one of the languages that is spoken in Kenya. I read it in English and it was translated by the author himself. Then I have a really random entry, and that is Vox Machina Kith and Kin by Marieke Niekamp, which was originally written in English, and I read it in English. It is one of the novels for the Vox Machina campaign by Critical Role. It was first published in 2021. I read it in 2023, and the author actually is Dutch, so she's from the Netherlands. So yeah, I took it for this challenge. Because again, while this is about reading more diversely, and I'm trying my best, I also need to just be kind to myself with this challenge sometimes. So, where's the next one? Yeah, next we have New Zealand, and again I have a white author. However, I obviously still want to read books by Maori authors. The book that I have planned right now, which I'm quite sure, because I think I googled it already, that was written by a Maori author, is Whale Rider, because Whale Rider was one of my favorite movies when I was growing up, and I absolutely loved that movie. I was bawling my eyes out every single time I watched it. So yeah, I just really want to read the book that it's based on. But yeah, the book that I have for now for New Zealand is Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Merrily, who is an author from New Zealand, and this was first written in or published in 1999. I read it first in 2010, and this was written in English, and I read it in English. Then we have the one African country that I just have so much to choose from, because it seems like every second author that you look for, or especially famous authors that are from Africa, as in Africa from the African continent, is from Nigeria. So I have a lot of authors to choose from Nigeria, because I think like at least half of the authors, or half of the African authors that I've read are Nigerian authors. But the book that I had to choose, because I don't know, if you haven't read this, or if you don't know anything about Nigerian literature, then it might be weird. But if you know anything about Nigerian literature, I just had to go with Chinua Achebe and with Things Fall Apart, which is like the African trilogy. It's Things Fall Apart is the first book in the African trilogy, and the African trilogy follows different generations in the same village during and after and before colonization. So yeah, this was first written in 1958. I read it in 2020, and it was written and I read it in English. We have another childhood favorite of mine, and that is Sophie's World by Jostein Gaarder. This was first written in 1991. I do not remember when I first read it, and this is about a young girl who one day starts getting letters, and those letters tell her about the world and about the history of philosophy. And I really enjoyed it. I don't remember if I said it already. This is by a Norwegian author. So it was first published in Norwegian. I read it in German, and the translator was Gabriele Hefs. The second book for this challenge that I read so far this year, so my January book, was the book from Palestine that I read, which was Minor Detail by Adania Shibli, which was published in 2017. I read it in 2024, obviously, and it was first written in Arabic. I read the English translation by Elizabeth Jacquet, and this is a dual timeline, one a year after the Nakba, following an Israeli soldier raping and killing a girl, and the other one is about a woman in the West Bank finding that story and becoming kind of obsessed with it. My book for Poland I don't have here currently because Scylla has it, and that is The Widow Queen by Elżbieta Czeresinska, which was first published in 2016. I read it in 2022. It was first published in Polish. I read the English translation by Mara Zakrzewska-Pym, and this one is historical fiction. I wouldn't call it historical fantasy. It's historical fiction with a few fantastical elements. Then we have Senegal, and for this I have At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop, which was first published in 2018, and I read it in 2021. It was originally published in French. The author did also spend some time in France, I believe in Paris it was. I read the English translation by Anna Moshkovakis, I think. So yeah, it follows a soldier during the First World War. So a black soldier during the First World War. Continuing on, we have South Africa. For this one I have another high fantasy with The Star Eater, Star Eater by Kirsten Hall. This was first published in 2021. I read it in 2021. And I read it in English. Then we have Sweden, and for that I had to go with the author that I'm not gonna say every European child, but definitely every Austrian child has ever read, and that is Astrid Lindgren. I chose Madita because personally I know everyone loves Pippi Longstocking. I didn't really read Pippi Longstocking that much. I mostly read Madita. This was first published in 1960. No clue anymore when I first read it. It was one of the first books that I read myself. And the original language was Swedish, and this translation is by Annalise Kornitsky, which is a German translation. Continuing on, we have Afterlives by Abdulrazak Gurna for Tanzania. This was published in 2020. I read it in 2022, which I believe was also the year in which the author won the Nobel Prize for Literature, or 2021. One of those 2 years. Written in English, I also read it in English. And this is a story set in Tanzania during and after the First World War. Maybe the second. I don't remember exactly anymore. Next we have Uganda. I have to be honest, in terms like aside from maybe actually even better than Europe, like I'm doing not that bad with reading multiple authors from different African countries. I think Africa, maybe not percentage wise, but Africa is definitely one of the continents where I read the most from so far. But yeah, Uganda with The First Woman by Jennifer Nansumbuga Makumbi. Sorry, I just had a hiccup. This was published in 2020. I read it in 2023. This is also a kind of generational storytelling, generational trauma, if I remember correctly. I have to be honest, I don't remember that much about it. But yeah, first written in English. I also read it in English. Next we have Ukraine, and for this I have The Four Profound Weaves by R.B. Lemberg, who is also an author who no longer lives in Ukraine, who just has a history of migrating a lot during their life. And this was first published in 2020. I read it in 2021. It was first published in English. I read it in English, and this is another one that's very much folklore inspired. In its world building, but also in its storytelling. UK and US, obviously I have plenty of books for both of those, so I just randomly picked a book out. For the UK, I decided to pick out Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, which was first published in 2019. I read it in 2019. It was published in English. And then for the US, I chose Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Boulley, which was first published in 2021. I read it in 2021, and it was published in English. This one is a story following multiple different women, but also I think one non-binary person, and kind of their stories, and this one is a YA thriller. Oh, I forgot one because I didn't add it to my list yet, and that is K.S. Veloso with The Wolf of Oren-Yaro, which is the first book in the Chronicles of the Witch Queen, another high fantasy story. And K.S. Veloso is a Filipina author, and this was also originally published in English. I read it in English. So, and now lastly, because I did say that I kind of track Indigenous authors separately a little bit, I have some Indigenous authors that I can comment on, well, not comment, but mention already. One of them is a little bit with a caveat, because when I was looking for which nation they belong to, there was a little bit on the Wikipedia article of that nation kind of being a little bit like, we don't claim her. That author was Rebecca Roanhorse, who is the author of, I picked up the second book, Black Sun, Between Earth and Sky, and she is a Black Indigenous author, or publishes under that identity. Kind of a little bit difficult of a situation here. I just wanted to mention her regardless. Then we have Stephen Graham Jones, who is Blackfoot Native American. This book, which I picked here, which was the only book I read by him, The Only Good Indians, was published in 2020, and I read it in 2021, and this is horror, following 4 men, I believe, who go on a killing spree of some elk, and then an elk woman comes after them. Then I have To Shape a Dragon's Breath by Moniquille Blackgoose, who is Seekonk Wampanoag. And this is YA high fantasy, kind of colonial fantasy, dark academia and aspects of it. Really enjoyed this book. And then lastly, just Angeline Boulley again, with Warrior Girl on Earth, and Angeline Boulley is Ojibwe. So yeah, this one I read last year. Was published 2023. I read it 2023. I don't know, by the way, if you can hear that there's a lot of rain outside. And I still have to go out in 20 minutes, and I currently don't have an umbrella at home. I hate my life. Anyway, so that is it for the very long video talking about which books I have on my read around the world so far. And then next year around the same time I will just try and tell you an update, tell you about that point 10, maybe I'll just make my update videos always in February, so I don't have that many videos to film in January, but you know, the 12 books that I read during the year. And so yeah, let's see how long it takes me to finish this challenge, and if I will still be filming videos by the time I finish this challenge. Tell me in the comments down below, have you read a lot of books by a lot of different authors all around the world? If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. If you have any recommendations for any of the countries that I haven't read from yet, also you are welcome to leave them down below. And for March, my next country is Algeria, where I do already have a book actually, but I forgot the title and the author. I have ordered it though. So yeah, with all of that said, I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!